The call to duty. The night was still in the small town of Maplewood as Officer James Reed sat in the patrol car with his partner, Officer Mia Chen. The streets were quiet, illuminated only by the occasional flicker of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. James was nearing retirement after 25 years on the force. He had seen his fair share of crime and chaos. However, tonight felt different. "Do you ever miss the city?" Mia asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. James chuckled softly. "Sometimes. But there's something peaceful about this place. It has its own charm." Their conversation was interrupted by a crackling voice over the radio. "All units, we have a 911 report of a suspected break-in at 57 Maple Street. Caller identifies as Harold Thompson, 82-year-old male veteran." James straightened in his seat, his instincts kicked in immediately. "That doesn't sound good," he said as he turned on the sirens. "Copy that," Mia replied as she acknowledged the dispatch call. Unit 3 responding. As they sped through the darkened streets towards Maple Street, James couldn't shake off an unsettling feeling in his gut. He had heard about Harold Thompson, a war hero who had served his country bravely but was now living alone in an old house on the outskirts of town. "Do you know anything about this guy?" Mia asked as they approached their destination. James shook his head. "Not much. Just that he's a veteran who hasn't been seen around lately." Arriving at the scene, they parked in front of a modest house that looked like it had seen better days. The porch light flickered ominously as they stepped out of their vehicle. James noticed an old dog lying on the porch, its eyes weary but alert. "Mr. Thompson?" James called out as they approached cautiously. An elderly man appeared from within the house, his frame thin and frail beneath layers of oversized clothing. His face was lined with age and worry as he leaned heavily against the doorframe. "That's me," he said hoarsely. "I'm glad you're here. What happened?" Mia asked gently. "I heard some noise from inside," Harold explained, his voice trembling slightly. "When I went to check it out, I found my window broken." James exchanged glances with Mia. Something felt off about this situation. "Can you show us where?" Harold nodded slowly and led them around to the back of the house where shards of glass littered the ground beneath a shattered window. "Did you see anyone?" James asked as he examined the broken glass carefully. "No," Harold replied with a sigh. "I just heard it break and my dog started barking." Mia began inspecting the area for footprints while James continued questioning Harold about what he had heard or seen prior to their arrival. "Mr. Thompson," James said cautiously, "are you feeling all right? You seem a bit unsteady." Harold waved him off dismissively but didn't meet his gaze directly. "I'm fine," he insisted weakly. As they moved back toward the front of the house, James noticed how poorly maintained it was. The paint was peeling, and there were signs of neglect everywhere. "Let's take a look inside," Mia suggested when they reached the door again. Harold hesitated for a moment before nodding reluctantly. As James opened the door, a wave of stale air hit them, a mix of dust and something else that felt heavy in their lungs. The interior was dimly lit and cluttered with years' worth of possessions piled high on every surface, old newspapers stacked precariously beside empty dog bowls that hadn't been cleaned in days. "Mr. Thompson," James said softly as they stepped further inside, "we need to ensure everything is secure." Harold shuffled into the living room behind them, leaning against a worn-out chair for support as Buddy, the old dog, followed closely at his heels. As they moved through the cramped space filled with shadows cast by flickering lights overhead, James couldn't shake off an overwhelming sense of concern for this man who had once fought for his country but now seemed lost in his own home. "Let's check that broken window," Mia suggested as she led them into what appeared to be a kitchen area where more glass lay scattered across the floor. As James examined it closely, he noticed something odd about how it had broken. The pattern seemed inconsistent with typical break-in scenarios he had encountered before. "Mr. Thompson," he called out gently without turning around, can you tell me more about what happened? I told you everything I know. Harold snapped suddenly, frustration bubbling over as he struggled to keep himself upright against the counter. James turned to face him fully now. There was fear in Harold's eyes that hadn't been there before, a fear that suggested this wasn't just about a simple burglary but something deeper lurking beneath the surface. Sir, James said firmly but kindly, we're here to help you. But I need you to be honest with me. Harold's shoulders slumped as if all energy had drained from him at once. He looked down at Buddy who lay patiently at his feet before whispering almost inaudibly, "It's just me. I don't want anyone else involved." The weight of those words hung heavily in the air between them. This wasn't just about an attempted break-in, it was about an elderly veteran struggling alone against forces far greater than any burglar could represent. As James exchanged another glance with Mia, both understanding that they were on the brink of uncovering something far more complex than they had anticipated, they knew their duty extended beyond simply investigating this incident. It was time to dig deeper into Harold's life and find out what truly lay beneath this troubling surface before it was too late. Uncovering the past. The air in Nate Walker's home felt thick with unspoken words and hidden struggles as Officer Marcus Jennings and Officer Sandra Torres exchanged concerned glances. The initial call about a suspected break-in had quickly morphed into a deeper investigation into the life of an elderly veteran. As they stood in the cramped kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of Nate's life, it became clear that this was not just about a broken window. "Mr. Walker," Marcus began gently, his voice steady, "I understand that you're proud of your independence, but it sounds like you could use some help." Nate's eyes narrowed slightly, his pride flaring up defensively. "I told you, I don't need charity," he insisted, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his vulnerability. "Help doesn't have to feel like charity," Sandra interjected softly, her tone reassuring. "We're here to make sure you're safe. That's our job." Nate looked between the two officers, his expression conflicted. The warmth of their concern clashed with his ingrained sense of self-reliance. "I've been fine on my own," he muttered, but there was a hint of doubt in his eyes. "Mr. Walker," Marcus pressed gently, "can we sit down and talk? I think it's important we understand what you're going through." After a moment's hesitation, Nate nodded slowly and led them into the small living room. The walls were lined with photographs, faded images capturing moments from a life well lived but now overshadowed by neglect. As they settled onto worn chairs that creaked under their weight, Marcus took a deep breath. "Tell me about your service," he prompted, hoping to draw Nate out of his shell. Nate's gaze drifted to a photograph on the wall, a younger version of himself in military uniform, standing proudly beside fellow soldiers. "I served in Vietnam," he said quietly, pride mingled with pain in his voice. "Came back with scars that never healed." Sandra leaned forward slightly. "That must have been incredibly difficult." "It was," Nate replied, his voice thickening with emotion. "But I managed. I always managed." He paused for a moment, lost in thought before continuing. "After the war, things changed. Friends disappeared into their own lives. I came back to a world that didn't understand what we'd been through." Marcus nodded understandingly. "That must have been isolating." Nate looked up sharply, as if Marcus had struck a nerve. "Isolation is one thing, it's the shame that gets you," he said bitterly. "People think veterans are heroes until they come home and realize we're just broken men trying to fit into a world that moved on without us." The weight of Nate's words hung heavy in the air as Sandra exchanged another glance with Marcus. They could see how deeply this man had been affected, not just by his experiences during the war but by the fallout that followed him home. "Have you had anyone to talk to about this?" Sandra asked gently. Nate shook his head vehemently. "No one wants to hear about it. They just want to forget." His voice cracked slightly as he continued, "I've spent years trying to forget myself." Marcus felt a pang of empathy for Nate. It was clear that this wasn't just about physical struggles but emotional ones as well. "It's okay to ask for help," he said softly. "You don't have to go through this alone." Nate looked down at Buddy, who lay at his feet with weary eyes, as if sensing the heaviness of the conversation. The old dog nudged Nate's hand gently, offering silent support. "Sometimes I think Buddy is all I have left," Nate admitted quietly, his voice breaking slightly. "We can help you find resources," Sandra suggested cautiously. "There are organizations that support veterans like yourself, people who understand what you've been through and can offer assistance." Nate's expression hardened again as he shook his head defiantly. "I don't want handouts. I want my dignity." "Dignity doesn't mean suffering in silence," Marcus replied firmly but compassionately. "It means taking care of yourself and accepting help when you need it." The room fell silent for a moment as Nate wrestled with his emotions. Finally, he sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair, exhaustion etched on his face. "I've lived alone for so long," he murmured almost to himself. "It's hard to let anyone in." Marcus leaned forward slightly, sensing an opening. "What if we helped you get back on your feet? You deserve to live comfortably and safely." Nate looked up sharply at Marcus' words. There was a flicker of hope mixed with skepticism in his eyes. "And what do I owe for that? More than what I can pay?" "No debt," Sandra said firmly. "Just support from people who care." After a long pause filled with uncertainty, Nate finally nodded slowly as if considering their offer for the first time. Maybe I could use some help after all," he admitted reluctantly. Marcus felt a surge of relief wash over him. They had made progress in breaking through Nate's defenses. "Let's start small," Marcus suggested gently. "How about we check your pantry? We can see what food you have and help stock it up if needed." As they moved into the kitchen again, Marcus noticed how Nate hesitated at first before opening the pantry door, a small space crammed with mismatched containers and dusty cans. "What do you have?" Sandra asked kindly as she peered inside. Nate shuffled closer and opened the door wider. Inside were remnants of meals long past, canned goods with labels peeling away and half-empty bags of rice. "It's enough for now," Nate said defensively. "Enough isn't good enough when it comes to your health," Marcus replied gently but firmly as he scanned the contents critically. Sandra nodded in agreement and began pulling out items one by one while Marcus took note of what was available. "We'll make sure you have enough food," she promised as she placed several items aside that looked expired or unappetizing. After assessing the pantry together, they moved back into the living room where Buddy watched them with curious eyes. "You know," Sandra said thoughtfully, breaking the tension that had settled over them again, "there are local food banks and community programs that can help provide meals regularly." Nate frowned but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared off into space as if lost in memories of better days gone by. Marcus seized the opportunity to shift gears slightly. "What about medical care? When was the last time you saw a doctor?" Nate shifted uncomfortably in his seat at the question. It was evident this was another sensitive topic for him. "I don't need anyone poking around at my age," he muttered defensively. "Your health is important." Sandra interjected gently but firmly again. "You deserve proper care, especially after everything you've been through." "I'm fine." Nate snapped suddenly before softening again almost immediately as he caught himself raising his voice. "Mr. Walker," Marcus said calmly yet firmly, "we're not here to judge you or tell you what to do, we just want to ensure your safety and well-being." A long silence stretched between them before Nate finally sighed heavily once more, a sound filled with resignation rather than defiance this time around. "I suppose. I haven't seen anyone in years," he admitted quietly after what felt like an eternity. Marcus felt encouraged by this admission. It signaled progress toward building trust between them, a crucial step toward helping Nate find stability again amidst all this chaos surrounding him. As they continued discussing potential resources available for veterans like him, food assistance programs or local clinics offering free services, the atmosphere shifted gradually from one filled with tension toward something resembling hopefulness instead. By the end of their conversation that evening, though much work remained ahead, they had laid down seeds for change within Nate Walker's life, seeds rooted deeply within compassion born out of understanding rather than judgment alone, a foundation upon which healing could begin anew after years spent battling unseen demons lurking just beneath surface-level reality itself. The community response. The following days after the break-in report at Nate Walker's home were a whirlwind of activity for officers Marcus Jennings and Sandra Torres. They had uncovered a troubling situation that extended far beyond a simple burglary. Nate's struggles resonated deeply with them, and they knew they had to take action, not just as officers of the law, but as members of the community. As they returned to the police station after their initial visit, Marcus felt a sense of urgency. "We can't just leave him like this," he said, his voice filled with determination. "He needs more than just a police report, he needs support." Sandra nodded in agreement. "We should reach out to local organizations that help veterans. There has to be something we can do to get him the assistance he needs." They began making calls to various veteran support groups and community organizations that offered resources for those in need. Each conversation revealed layers of bureaucracy and red tape, but Marcus and Sandra persisted, fueled by their concern for Nate. After several hours of phone calls, they finally connected with a local nonprofit organization called Veterans United. The representative on the other end was sympathetic and eager to help. "We have programs specifically designed for veterans facing hardships," she explained. "We can send someone out to assess his situation and provide immediate assistance." "Thank you," Marcus replied, relief washing over him. "Can you send someone as soon as possible? He's in a tough spot." "Absolutely," the representative assured him. "We'll dispatch someone right away." As they hung up, Sandra turned to Marcus with a smile. "That's one step closer. Now we just need to make sure Nate is open to accepting help when they arrive." Later that day, they decided to pay another visit to Nate's home. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground as they approached his modest house once more. Buddy greeted them at the door with a wagging tail, though his eyes still held a hint of sadness. "Hey there, Buddy," Sandra said gently as she knelt down to pet the old dog. Nate appeared from inside, looking slightly better than before but still weary. His oversized clothes hung loosely on his frail frame, and there was a hint of apprehension in his eyes as he regarded the officers. "Good evening, Mr. Walker," Marcus said warmly. "We wanted to check in on you." Nate nodded slowly but didn't say much. He seemed hesitant about their presence, perhaps still grappling with the idea of needing help. "We've been talking to some organizations that assist veterans," Sandra explained carefully. "They're willing to provide support, food, medical care, whatever you need." Nate's expression hardened slightly at the mention of help. "I don't want any handouts," he replied defensively. "It's not a handout, it's support," Marcus countered gently but firmly. "You've been through so much already, and you shouldn't have to face this alone." Nate looked down at Buddy, who was now resting his head on Nate's knee, offering silent comfort. After a moment of silence, he sighed heavily. "I appreciate it. I really do, but I've always taken care of myself. Sometimes letting others help is part of taking care of yourself," Sandra said softly, her voice filled with empathy. Just then, there was a knock at the door that interrupted their conversation. Nate looked startled for a moment before slowly moving to answer it. Standing outside was Sarah Mitchell from Veterans United, a woman in her early 40s with an approachable demeanor and an air of confidence that immediately put Nate at ease. "Hello." Sarah greeted cheerfully as she stepped inside after Nate opened the door. "I'm here to see how we can assist you today." Nate hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let her in. As Sarah entered, her eyes scanned the cluttered living room filled with remnants of Nate's life, old photographs, stacks of newspapers, and empty dog bowls. "Wow," she said softly, taking in her surroundings with compassion rather than judgment. "It looks like you've been through quite a bit." "Just trying to get by," Nate replied quietly. Sarah smiled warmly at him before turning her attention back to Buddy, who had approached her with curiosity. "And who is this handsome fellow?" she asked as she knelt down to give Buddy some affection. "That's Buddy," Nate said proudly despite himself. "He's my best friend." "I can see why." Sarah laughed lightly before standing back up and shifting her focus back to Nate. "I'm here to help you get back on your feet if you're ready for that." Nate shifted uncomfortably but didn't respond immediately. "Let's start by assessing your needs," Sarah suggested gently as she pulled out a clipboard from her bag. "I'd like to ask you some questions about your situation, your health, living conditions, anything that might be affecting you right now." As they began discussing Nate's circumstances, his health issues and financial struggles, Marcus and Sandra stood back slightly, allowing him space while remaining close by for support. Nate opened up about how he had been managing alone since his wife passed away several years ago. It had been tough without her companionship or support system. "I thought I could handle it all myself," he admitted quietly, looking down at Buddy, who remained faithfully by his side. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," Sarah reassured him gently as she took notes on her clipboard. "There are resources available that can help you with food security and medical care, things that will make your life easier." Nate looked skeptical but intrigued. Perhaps there was hope after all. As Sarah continued asking questions about Nate's needs, his access to food and healthcare, it became clear that he had been living in isolation for far too long without proper support or assistance. "I just didn't want anyone feeling sorry for me," he confessed finally, his voice breaking slightly under the weight of his emotions. "No one is here out of pity," Marcus interjected softly but firmly. "We're here because we care about your well-being, and we want you to know it's okay to ask for help when you need it." With each passing moment spent talking with Sarah about potential solutions for his struggles, the possibility of food deliveries or assistance with medical appointments, Nate began to feel something shift within himself, an opening up rather than closing off, a willingness rather than resistance toward accepting help from those who genuinely wanted what was best for him. As their conversation progressed into practical solutions, discussing local food banks and clinics where he could receive care without cost, it became evident that change was beginning anew within Nate Walker's life, change rooted not only in compassion but also community support readying itself around him like arms readying themselves for embrace when needed most desperately during times filled with uncertainty ahead. A helping hand. The atmosphere in Nate Walker's home was heavy with unspoken truths and the weight of years spent in solitude. As Officer Marcus Jennings and Officer Sandra Torres observed the scene before them, they realized that their role had shifted from mere responders to advocates for this elderly veteran. The reality of Nate's situation was becoming painfully clear. He was not just a victim of a potential burglary, he was a man struggling to survive in a world that had seemingly forgotten him. As Nate knelt beside Buddy, his loyal dog, Marcus felt a surge of compassion. The old man's frailty was evident, but it was the emotional burden he carried that truly struck Marcus. "Mr. Walker," he began gently, "we're here to help you. You don't have to go through this alone." Nate looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've always managed," he said, though his voice trembled with uncertainty. "I don't want to be a burden to anyone." "You're not a burden," Sandra interjected, her tone firm yet kind. "You've served your country, now it's time for your community to serve you." Nate's shoulders slumped further as he absorbed their words. The pride that had kept him standing for so long was beginning to crack under the weight of reality. I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's why we're here," Marcus reassured him. "Let us help you find the resources you need. We can connect you with local organizations that specialize in assisting veterans." As they spoke, Marcus pulled out his phone and began searching for nearby veteran support services while Sandra continued to engage Nate in conversation. She asked about his daily routine and any specific needs he might have, all the while maintaining an empathetic demeanor. "I don't eat much these days," Nate confessed, glancing down at Buddy who lay beside him, ever watchful. "Just whatever I can find." "Have you eaten today?" Sandra pressed gently. Nate hesitated before shaking his head. Not really. Marcus looked up from his phone, concern etched across his features. We need to get you some food right away, he said decisively. There are local food banks that can provide meals and groceries. I can't take charity, Nate protested weakly. It's not charity, it's support, Sandra countered firmly. You've earned it through your service and sacrifice. As they continued discussing resources available to him, food assistance programs and medical clinics, Nate began to open up about his life post-service, revealing the isolation he had faced since losing his wife years ago. I thought I could handle it all on my own, he admitted, his voice cracking with emotion. But it's been harder than I ever imagined. Marcus felt a pang of empathy for Nate. The old man's vulnerability resonated deeply within him. He could see how much pride Nate had in having served his country, but also how that same pride had prevented him from seeking help when he needed it most. Let's take this one step at a time, Marcus suggested, trying to keep the conversation focused on solutions rather than dwelling on the past. First, we'll get you some food and then look into setting up regular visits from a healthcare provider. Nate nodded slowly, the fight beginning to leave him as hope flickered in his eyes, a small light amidst the darkness that had enveloped him for so long. Okay, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll accept your help. Great! Sandra exclaimed, her enthusiasm infectious as she pulled out her phone to start making calls. Let's get you fed first. While Sandra arranged for food delivery from a local charity organization, Marcus took the opportunity to talk with Nate about longer-term solutions, how they could connect him with services that provided assistance not just for food but also for medical care and companionship. Have you thought about reaching out to other veterans? Marcus asked gently. There are support groups where you can connect with people who understand what you've been through. Nate looked thoughtful at this suggestion. It seemed like an idea he hadn't considered before. I suppose I never thought about it. I always figured they'd moved on too, he murmured. They might have moved on in some ways, Marcus replied, but many veterans still carry those experiences with them, just like you do. As Sandra finished her call and approached them with a smile, she announced that food would arrive shortly, a small victory in their efforts to help Nate regain some semblance of normalcy. Now let's talk about your health, she said as she sat down across from Nate again. When was the last time you saw a doctor? Nate shifted uncomfortably at the question. There was an unmistakable tension in his posture as if admitting this would somehow strip away what little dignity he had left. It's been years, he finally admitted reluctantly. I don't have insurance anymore, and I've been too proud to ask for help. We can help with that too, Sandra reassured him quickly. There are clinics that offer services on a sliding scale or even free care for veterans like yourself. Nate looked skeptical but intrigued at the prospect of receiving medical attention without financial burden looming over him. Would you be willing to let us set up an appointment? Marcus asked gently. After several moments of silence filled only by Buddy's soft breathing beside him, Nate nodded slowly once more, a small but significant step toward reclaiming control over his life. All right, if it means getting back on my feet again, he conceded quietly. With each passing minute spent discussing potential solutions, food deliveries and healthcare appointments, the atmosphere in Nate's home began to shift from one of despair toward something resembling hopefulness instead. As they talked and planned together, the three of them forming an unlikely alliance against loneliness and hardship, Marcus couldn't help but feel grateful for this unexpected turn of events. What had started as just another routine call had blossomed into something far more meaningful. An opportunity not just to serve but also to uplift someone who had given so much yet received so little in return. By the time the doorbell rang signaling the arrival of food from the charity organization, a simple meal but one filled with warmth, Nate Walker was no longer just an isolated veteran struggling alone, he was now part of a community willing to rally around him during this challenging chapter of life, a community readying itself for embrace when needed most desperately amidst uncertain times ahead. A new beginning. The atmosphere in Nate Walker's home had transformed from one of despair to a fragile hope as the officers and Sarah Mitchell from Veterans United worked together to create a plan for his future. The reality of Nate's situation was stark, but it was clear that he was no longer alone in facing his struggles. The warmth of community support began to envelop him like a comforting blanket, offering solace during this tumultuous time. As Nate sat on the floor beside Buddy, his loyal dog, he felt a mix of emotions swirling within him: fear, gratitude, and the dawning realization that perhaps he didn't have to shoulder this burden alone anymore. He looked up at Marcus and Sandra, who were discussing potential resources with Sarah, and felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. "Mr. Walker," Sarah said gently as she approached him after finishing her conversation with the officers. "We're going to get you the help you need. You deserve to live comfortably and safely." Nate nodded slowly, still processing the whirlwind of events that had unfolded since that fateful night. I never thought it would come to this," he admitted quietly, glancing down at Buddy who lay beside him, his eyes filled with understanding. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed," Sandra reassured him, kneeling down to meet his gaze. "What matters now is that we're here for you." With the officer's encouragement, Sarah began outlining a plan to address Nate's immediate needs. "First, we'll arrange for food deliveries to ensure you have enough to eat," she explained. "Then we can connect you with healthcare services that can check on your health regularly." Nate listened intently as Sarah spoke, her words painting a picture of a brighter future, one where he wouldn't have to rely solely on the stove for warmth or worry about where his next meal would come from. Additionally, Sarah continued, "We have support groups for veterans where you can connect with others who understand what you've been through. It might help to talk with people who share similar experiences." The thought of opening up to others felt daunting yet strangely comforting. Nate had spent so many years in isolation that the idea of sharing his story with fellow veterans was both frightening and liberating. "I'll think about it," he replied softly, feeling a sense of vulnerability wash over him. As they discussed logistics for food deliveries and healthcare appointments, Marcus took a moment to step outside for some fresh air. The cold night air hit him like a wave, clearing his mind as he reflected on the gravity of what they had uncovered inside Nate's home. Returning inside, Marcus found Sandra and Sarah still engaged in conversation with Nate. He could see the old man's demeanor shifting. There was a glimmer of hope in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Hey, Nate," Marcus said as he re-entered the room. "I just wanted to let you know that we're going to make sure you're safe moving forward. This isn't just about tonight, it's about your well-being." Nate looked up at him with gratitude etched across his face. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know where to turn." "We'll help you find your way," Sandra promised as she stood beside Marcus. As they finalized plans for food deliveries and healthcare services, Nate felt an unfamiliar sense of relief beginning to wash over him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was fighting an uphill battle alone. Later that week, food deliveries began arriving at Nate's doorstep, fresh groceries and prepared meals that filled his kitchen with warmth and nourishment. Each delivery served as a reminder that he was no longer isolated. There were people who cared about him and wanted to see him thrive. Sarah continued visiting regularly, checking in on Nate's health and ensuring he was receiving proper medical care. With each visit, she brought not only supplies but also companionship, a friendly face who listened without judgment. Nate found himself slowly opening up during these visits, sharing stories from his past, his time in Vietnam, memories of his late wife, and the struggles he faced after returning home. Each story felt like a weight lifted off his shoulders. It was cathartic to share his experiences with someone who understood. As weeks turned into months, Nate began attending support group meetings organized by Veterans United. Surrounded by fellow veterans who shared similar stories of struggle and resilience, he found solace in their camaraderie. They laughed together, cried together, and supported one another through their shared experiences, a brotherhood forged in adversity. Buddy remained at Nate's side throughout this journey, the old dog had become a symbol of loyalty and love during these challenging times. With regular meals and newfound companionship from both humans and fellow veterans alike, Buddy seemed to thrive alongside Nate. One evening after returning home from a support group meeting filled with laughter and connection, Nate sat down at the kitchen table with Buddy curled up at his feet. He looked around at the once neglected space now filled with life, pictures hung on the walls showcasing moments from happier times, fresh groceries filled the fridge, warmth radiated from an electric heater that had replaced the dangerous stove. With tears in his eyes but a smile on his face, Nate realized how far he had come since that fateful night when Officers Jennings and Torres first arrived at his door. He had faced darkness alone for too long but now stood surrounded by light, the light of community support and genuine care. As he stroked Buddy's fur gently while reflecting on this journey toward healing, a journey made possible through compassion, Nate understood that it was never too late for new beginnings. It was never too late to ask for help or embrace change when needed most desperately. In this small town where loneliness once reigned supreme over him like an unyielding shadow now stood hope, a beacon guiding him toward brighter days ahead filled not only with survival but also connection, a chance at living fully again amidst all uncertainties life may bring.